Welcome everybody to this amazing offering by the folks at KetoCon. I'm super excited to be here. I know that by now a lot of us are probably used to seeing each other on a screen. I'll tell you, as a presenter, it's definitely been interesting for me, and I've spoken to a lot of my friends when it comes to this, because we're super comfortable standing in front of an audience full of people, but it's always weirder when we're just standing here with the camera on us. It's just not the same. But super happy to be here. Very grateful to be here and for this opportunity. What I'm going to be talking about today is a topic that I think is very relevant right now. We've seen a lot of great info from a lot of people in the health community, the keto community, talking about all of these conditions that are linked with morbidity and mortality. So, disease and death. And unfortunately, the mainstream just hasn't picked it up. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is building resilience, because while it's important to wash our hands and, practice good hygiene and social distance and all those things, I think a lot of the unintended effects of this lockdown have been poor health and, reduced metabolic flexibility and a bunch of other downstream effects. So moving forward, hopefully keeping these things in mind will help you moving forward. And I'm going to share my screen now. All right. Looks like we're good. All right. So the topic of my talk is called Building Resilience. And it's all about thriving in this post-COVID-19 world. However you define the new normal, it's definitely going to be a different world that we live in after this. And I think some of the good things that will come of this is hopefully focusing on the do's and don'ts that I mentioned here. But first, let's look at, a little bit about me. If you don't know who I am, my name's Danny Vega. I'm the co-host of the Fat Fuel Family podcast with my lovely wife, Maura. I've created the Carnivore Keto Cut, and as well as the Keto Muscle Intelligence program. I was a strength and conditioning coach for VCU basketball, and I have my master's in human performance from the University of Florida. I also competed in powerlifting and hit the top 25 in the country with the 1,700 total, raw total. And I've also been a top ranked indoor rower. So the first thing I thought of when I was kind of creating this presentation is resilience, because what we see is that there's a lot of people that are infected all over the world, but different responses. And I've seen some really interesting takes on why that is. One that I tend to favor is this issue of toxicity. And when there's increased toxicity, whether it's from diet or, environmental stressors, poor air pollution, EMF, there seems to be worse outcomes. And one of the ways that we can just be stronger and be able to handle these viruses and other infections and anything that comes up is building resilience. So I love what Dr. Rhonda Patrick says about this. She's big on stress. Avoiding all stress isn't the answer to fighting aging. It's about building resilience to environmental stress. So look, building resilience is how we've survived this long. One of the things that I love to hear all the time is there's something going around. And people are always talking about how, I got sick because there's something going around. And what people don't understand is that viruses, bacteria, exosome, all these different things are always around. It has nothing to do with the virus unless it's something that's specifically virulent or, just a more serious illness. But when it comes to this, we need to be resilient. We need to be able to fight these things off. One of the things that I thought was interesting as I, prepared for this was that ancient viruses are buried in our DNA. There's a protein called hemo, which is not even made by the mother. It's made by the fetus and the placenta. And it comes from a gene that originally came from a virus that infected our ancestors. So bacteria, viruses, exosomes, all of those things are vital to our survival as a species. And our ability to withstand extreme climate, survive in times of hunger, fight infection, build emotional resilience. It all comes from our exposure to stress and the subsequent response. So I think a healthy amount of stressors and challenges leads to improved resilience. And like I said, that could be physical resilience, emotional resilience. And we'll start with a few important terms. Allostatic load is basically the wear and tear on the body, which accumulates as an individual is exposed to repeated or chronic stress. And the key is finding that right balance. For example, when you see here that performance is going to suffer when there's no stress. When there's little to no stress, you will not be able to improve performance. You'll see that when there's too high of a stress, performance takes a dip. But there's this optimal level here between over fatigue and over exhaustion, and under fatigue and under exhaustion, where improved performance is improved. And that's this happy medium where we need to be just finding ways to challenge ourselves, to stress ourselves, and allow our bodies to respond, because we've developed many responses to stress. And it's interesting how across the board they're just built in, which I think is important for us to just continue to kind of increase that load to a healthy level. The other thing that you need to know about, is you've probably heard about it by now, is hormetic stress. So hormesis is defined as a dose-response phenomenon characterized by low-dose stimulation and high-dose inhibition, and has been recognized as representing an overcompensation for mild environmental stress. So you introduce a stressor, and our body responds, and then we are better off after. Of course, the same thing with allostatic load. If you have too many hormetic stressors, then it's no longer going to trigger hormesis. It's going to actually, the dose will become harmful. So there's always that sweet spot. And that's one of the things that we want to just always be mindful of is just keeping a good balance of stress. I've talked about managing stress in the past. I've done whole presentations on that. And I think it's interesting that today I'm talking all about stress and why we need stress. I think it's because a lot of us have been told to stay home, and not only stay home, but stay inside. And, there's a lot of things that a lot of unintended consequences that we're seeing because of that. And if we're just mindful of these things, I think over time we can become more resilient and hopefully decrease not only the rate of infections, but just the way, these more serious outcomes, we can decrease those. So you have to understand the interplay between exposure to stress and its effects, so that you can understand how to build resilience. So let's talk about a few healthy stressors. So the first one I want to talk about is sunlight, because, just like bacteria, when we discovered bacteria, we were like, oh no, germs, and then we started to develop vaccines and all of these things, antibacterials, and all of these things that attack bacteria, but there are benefits to bacteria, similar to the sun. The sun UV rays can be harmful, and the overwhelming majority of skin cancers are caused by overexposure to UV light. It can also lead to immunosuppression and compromise immunosurveillance. So meaning that our bodies would not be able to detect viruses and other bacteria early enough to fight them, because of the response, our body's response to too much UV exposure. But at the same time, sunlight is also very healthy. Sunlight exposure is essential to ensuring proper levels of circulating vitamin D, and vitamin D and vitamin A as well have been linked to just better outcomes when it comes to infection. So while we may be stressing ourselves out going out into the sun, it's a net positive when it comes to that. This was a really interesting study that I looked at just from a month ago or so. And what they looked at was vitamin D levels and COVID-19 mortality and morbidity. And what they found is that if you had an average of 56 millimoles per liter, which is kind of a recommended vitamin D level, was strongly associated with the number of cases, respectively, with mortality. So if you had lower vitamin D levels, it was pretty clear that you had higher cases as well as higher mortality, as well as, if we don't get enough UV exposure, it may hurt our immunity. So linked to vitamin D, but there's a lot of other reasons why the sun, we are, there's no way that we're not autotrophs, so we don't just get fed by the sun, but we do get a lot of benefits from the sun, and it feeds a lot of our systems and just helps us become more resilient. Of course, aerobic exercise is huge, and not only aerobic exercise, like light walking, it's important to get your heart rate up. It may flush bacteria out of the lungs. This may reduce our chances of infection. Exercise also causes change in antibodies and white blood cells, and an increased heart rate causes antibodies or white blood cells to circulate more rapidly, which help them detect illness earlier. This brief rise that we have in body temperature during and right after exercise may prevent bacteria from growing and may help the body fight infection better. Similar to what happens when we have a fever. One of the things that we are very adamant about with our sons is we do not fight fevers unless it gets really, really bad. The fever is there for a reason. It's our friend. It's part of this hormetic or this response that we have to stress or to infection. And exercise also slows down the release of stress hormones. And we know that there's several of these stress hormones that are linked to illness. So if we can keep those in check, that helps us as well. Now, resistance training, I was excited about this one because there's several reasons why resistance training is important. One of the first things I learned when I learned, how do people put on muscle is the role of the inflammatory response. So, the inflammatory response could be something, it doesn't have to just be mechanical, like, tearing muscles apart. It could be injury from bacteria, trauma, that would be the training. Toxins, heat, or any other cause. These damaged cells release chemicals that cause blood vessels to leak fluid into the tissues. This causes swelling, and it plays a vital role in hypertrophy and building resilience. So one of the first things I learned was to never take, a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, an NSAID, after training, because that would blunt my inflammatory response. And then concurrently, also decrease the rate of hypertrophy, because this response, when the body has this emergency, in the case of muscles, we have these microscopic things called sarcomeres, and basically in response to this injury, our body adds more sarcomeres in series next to each other, but they're also bigger, so it protects us from future injury, and on and on and on. So that's linked to that first term, another first term, which is progressive overload. We have to continuously add load for us to grow muscle. And I think that that's true for many things in life. We want to continually challenge ourselves a little bit more and just improve our resilience. There's a link to reduced risk of low-grade inflammation-related diseases, such as cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes, two of the comorbidities linked with more serious cases of COVID-19. Mitophagy is another important role of resistance training. And mitophagy is basically the removal of damaged mitochondria through autophagy, autophagy is the removal of damaged cells in order to regenerate newer, healthier cells. This appears to increase by 8 weeks of an exercise cycle. This was in an animal study. And these proteins may target the mitochondria with the most damage and remove them. So it's basically getting rid of all of your weak mitochondria, which is fantastic. The other thing is that we know that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. So there's research suggesting that caloric restriction in conjunction with exercise may also improve autophagy. And it's a very important thing to do both of them. I'll talk a little bit about caloric restriction in a minute here. But the other thing that's very important, because we know that we lose mitochondria as we age. So if we're resistance training, we may trigger mitochondrial biogenesis, which is the creation of new mitochondria, which is fantastic. So you see on this graph here, very simple graph. I just put this here because the other thing that resistance training does is it adds lean body mass. So if we have a lot of lean body mass, we see that number one, we'll be fighting against anorexia, sarcopenia, these diseases of attrition and then obesity and metabolic syndrome. Conversely, if we have too much fat, we'll go on the other end. But we see that middle there where we have a good amount of lean body mass and a low amount of fat that gives us the lowest morbidity. Very simple graph there. Now, caloric restriction is one of those things that have been studied for a very long time, and especially with regards to longevity. But caloric restriction is important. You know, it's not malnutrition, so it's really just a slight under eating, just eating under your total daily what is that TDEE. Now I'm forgetting what that is, but just eating under that for a little bit. And it increases the survival of laboratory animals by delaying the aging process. And it has beneficial effects on various physiological symptoms, including the immune system. So overall, this is in one study that was in animals, the immunological status of rodents fed a restricted diet is superior to the immunological status of the non-restricted animals, and it might retard aging and immunosenescence. Immunosenescence is a term you may have heard of recently because of the fact that older people tend to respond more poorly to these infections. So it's the gradual deterioration of the immune system just brought about by aging. So that's one of the reasons why you see these older populations in general do not do well with infections, you know, similar to what happened in 2017 when we had a much higher death rate than COVID-19 with the flu. You know, we had a 7% death rate, and the most affected populations were these older populations. So another interesting thing about why we should be reducing our calories is the size of adipocytes, which are just fat cells, increases during obesity. So now you have these resident immune cells that you know, make their home in adipose tissue, and that becomes an important source of pro-inflammatory mediators, meaning that they can increase inflammation more. And what exercise and caloric restriction would do is basically make your fat cells smaller and make that less of a chance of happening. When you have less fat cells, you have less of a chance of this happening. Exercise and caloric restriction modulate resident immune cells in adipose tissue, meaning they just kind of make them work better in spite of an equivalent body weight reduction. So we know that sometimes when people lose weight, they're not as resilient. For example, with cancer, you know, we just had someone on the podcast, interestingly, that his brother had an immune, you know, HIV, basically had HIV. And one of the biggest things that they, you know, back in the 80s when this happened, they were talking about how he needed to keep his weight up. And so they kept feeding him these really high carb, sugary foods, not knowing that that would probably make things worse, just because the main focus was on body weight. But we know that if we have lean body mass, that's not going to happen. So that's important to consider. And that's basically it for caloric restriction. Now, this is a very important one because we know that not only does ultraviolet UV rays kill viruses, but heat is very important. Sauna bathing is one of those things. Now, I know that the gyms are not open right now, and I know everyone cannot afford a sauna, but I can guarantee you that there are several ways for you to simulate a sauna if you get creative. So just finding ways to expose yourself to heat will be very useful. The person who did the most work on this is an MD and PhD. I believe he's an MD, PhD, Dr. Jari Laukkanen out of Finland. Amazing studies he did on not only cardiovascular benefits of sauna bathing, but as well as just neurological brain benefits. And he writes here in this important study that was published in the Mayo Clinic, a 2018 Mayo Clinic publication, is that sauna bathing may be linked to several health benefits, which include reduction in risk of vascular diseases such as high blood pressure. Remember, high blood pressure was one of the biggest comorbidities in these more serious cases. Cardiovascular disease, neurocognitive diseases, meaning that it's brain protective if you're doing this regularly. Non-vascular conditions such as pulmonary diseases. So we're talking about a lot of these SARS type illnesses that that have become so prevalent in the last 20, 30 years. Mortality, all cause mortality. So what they found was that if you sauna bathed at least 3 times a week for I believe it was at least 20 minutes in 176 degrees, that you reduce your risk of all-cause mortality really significantly. I want to say 50%, but it was amazing. That means that if you regularly sauna bathe, you will live longer. It's just what the studies are showing, and it seems that they're able to replicate the data. They continue to do research on this. It also has a great effect on your immune system. So regular sauna bathing may improve cardiovascular function. And basically it makes your endothelium healthier, which is the outer layer of your blood vessels, as well as reduce the arterial stiffness. So while we do see an acute increase in blood pressure while sauna bathing, over time, blood pressure should probably decrease with sauna bathing, and lower, like I said, lower systemic blood pressure. The other interesting thing that I loved, because it's just so, again, it's so relevant, is that Dr. Laukkanen said that there's also evidence that sauna exposure could boost the immune system, which may partly explain why sauna baths reduce susceptibility to common colds and prevent infection in healthy individuals. I can tell you anecdotally that in my house, when we feel like we have something coming on and there's no fever, we will hop in the sauna, and we find that that it tends to go away or not progress the way it would have probably progressed. Of course, this is one that Dr. Rhonda Patrick was the person who turned me on to this like 3 years ago or so, and she loves talking about her heat shock proteins. That these are very important proteins produced by cells in response to exposure to stressful conditions. They used to think that it was only after heat, because that was the original one that they studied. But now we know that it also includes exposure to cold, UV light, and during wound healing or tissue remodeling. Now, of course, let's talk about unhealthy stressors, because we have a lot of unhealthy stressors nowadays, and these are the ones that you want to really pay attention to. We talk all the time about washing our hands and social distancing and all these other things, and while we're wearing our masks, we totally forget the fact that the box of Cheetos that we're putting in our cart is going to affect our health. What we consume, not only in our diets, but the information that we consume, the screen time. It's very, very clear that staying locked up in your house and watching TV and your telephone and your iPad all day is going to have profound negative effects on your health. And what I picked is just a selection, because I could have gone on. There's so many other things, affect how it affects your vision, neurological effects. There's posture, because you're sitting all the time. There's a lot of things that extended screen time and prolonged screen time can do to adversely affect your health. But let's first talk about a few important ones. Melatonin. We know that prolonged exposure to screens may lower your melatonin levels, which it regulates your sleep and plays an important role in strengthening the immune system. If any of you have been following this COVID-19 situation, there was one study that showed that one of the reasons why children do so well is that they have higher melatonin levels, and children tend to not be on their screens all day the way adults are. They tend to be playing more and doing more of that, hopefully. And so sleep deprivation can damage the immune system and be an indirect cause, creating risk of cancer and other illnesses. Of course, lower melatonin levels, that's one of those things that were linked to higher morbidity when it came to these COVID-19 type of illnesses. The next one, stress hormones. Attention can be impaired via norepinephrine and cortisol following psychological stress. This was video game users that were put on a video game for 15 minutes, and then they asked them to do a bunch of tasks and see what their what their attention was like. Interestingly, what I did not understand, and this is why I didn't put it in the presentation, is that another study that I was looking at showed lower cortisol in children who were on screens. But that's not necessarily a good thing. It seemed like they had a lower just ability to cope with stress. And cortisol is very important when it comes to managing stress levels. It's our main stress hormone. Increased insulin. Here's another one that's very clear. I picked this one study, but I came across another study 5 years later that was just a meta-analysis looking at all of the literature on this. But teens who spent over 2 hours a day using computers and devices possessed higher insulin levels than those spending less time. And those higher insulin levels put them at a greater risk of diabetes, atherosclerosis, and metabolic disorder and obesity. We've seen a lot of stuff in the news media recently about vascular disorders. And, if you have atherosclerosis or your vascular health is not good, again, if you get an infection, you're not going to do well. So increased insulin levels, of course, are not only because of the fact that they're sitting down, they're not working out. They also tend to overeat, which brings me to my next point, obesity. Several studies link increased screen time with overeating. We tend to confuse our hunger signals when we're on the screen, because we mindlessly eat, and it's like we're not even there. We're just kind of like on autopilot while we're in this screen, which is one of those things that we should be aware of. And this is just one of the many reasons why this should be a big issue. I mean, I think that if we really want to build health and not just treat disease, we need to look at these things that so many people who are talking about, washing your hands and social distancing and wearing the masks, they're not talking about screen time and how that affects our health. And they're not talking about metabolic health, which is just so important. So obesity, increased obesity because of just increased time on the screen. A lot of us are less active right now because we've been stuck at home. And that can also, it's been very clear for me, my wife and I, that we haven't really changed much the way we've eaten, but we've both put on a little bit of weight because our activity levels are not the same as they were before. Now, screen novelty and dopamine, this is one of the most concerning effects. And this is the one that, you hear a lot of these tech giants, the actual CEOs and the executives at these companies, they don't let their kids have the very products that they sell. Bill Gates and his wife, I think they didn't let their child have an iPad until they were 18 or something. A lot of these people are not allowing their kids to even have an iPhone, let alone, use one. They understand screen novelty. Screen novelty is the rapid presentation of material on screens. It's one of the reasons why our average attention span has decreased significantly in the last decade. And then there's this dopamine cycle that, that happens when we watch screens, video games, we get a hit of dopamine, and this intensive and prolonged use may cause long-term changes in the brain to where we are, the addiction, it's very similar. It simulates a situation of substance dependence where and I know a lot of you reading or watching this can understand that, like we mindlessly look at our phone and we get that little dopamine hit, we put it back down, so these are just things that you should be mindful of. Of course, toxicity in our diets and environments. This is, I could have spent several slides on this one, but first of all, the most important one is, let's talk about the diet, because we have things like processed vegetable oils. They contain a much higher amount of omega-6 fatty acids, which are inflammatory, versus the anti-inflammatory omega-3 fatty acids. They lead to oxidative stress, and they affect the KIND pathway in a way that stimulates glutamate and lowers GABA. Again, just leading to increased excitability. We're not as calm. And that's also, one of the other ones that I didn't mention. one of the reasons why, melatonin is lower when we're on the screen, and we're more excitable. We have increased levels of glutamate, and it lowers GABA, and it also can affect your balance of serotonin and dopamine. So not good. Processed vegetable oils. The other thing, that if you look at high levels of glutamate, it increases BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is basically one of our main ways to grow new neurons. Like, it's only recently that we've learned that we can grow new neurons through things like, BDNF is one of them, NGF, nerve growth factor, or neuro growth factor. So these are things that, if we continue to make them, and if we continue to have lifestyles that keep that BDNF high, things like exercise, there's adaptogenic herbs that can increase BDNF. There's lion's mane, for example, has been shown to increase BDNF and improve cognitive function in older patients who are experiencing mild cognitive impairment. If we have too high levels of glutamate, we decrease BDNF. It also shrinks the hippocampus, and it causes injuries to proteins, lipids, and DNA and mitochondria. I think I mentioned that sunlight also can damage the DNA, which is very important to look at, because a lot of these mutations is where we see cancers, is where we see tumors growing. So we do not want damaged DNA. Excess sugar consumption. This is just one of those things that, by now, a lot of us should be very well aware of the fact that processed sugars and just all of these added sugars are, one, just completely inconsistent with the way we've eaten as humans over the eons, but it causes metabolic dysregulation. And it's very telling to me that, when I was a medical device rep for a decade, and it was telling to me that, in the hospital, patients were told to decrease their sugar before an operation because it would decrease the risk of infection. So there's very clearly a link between high blood sugar and these blood sugar swings that you get when you consume a high sugar diet, and our immune health, and again, of course, our resilience. So having more stable blood sugar levels, again, that's linked as well as to having lower insulin levels, that decreases inflammation, that improves our metabolic health. And I did have to talk about this because, again, there are several doctors around the world, and for different reasons, that are interestingly talking about these links between levels of toxicity in our environments and morbidity or mortality associated with infections like COVID-19. So, for example, we see in places like Italy and China, where the air quality is terrible, where they smoke a lot, they've had very, very bad outcomes. Some of these other places, there may be, some of this EMF issues, is 5G at play in some of these. The bottom line is that when we have higher toxicity in a certain environment, that population is going to be more susceptible to illness, and they're also likely going to be more vulnerable and just not able to defend themselves as well. And that's clear. That's becoming more and more clear. One of the other things is plastics. I know that anyone who knows me knows that I've spoken about plastics and xenoestrogens. First was introduced to this by the work of Dr. Anthony J., a good friend who's he's a epigeneticist at the Mayo Clinic. And we know that plastics are hormonally disruptive. We know that they've been linked to various metabolic disorders and other disorders, cancers, all of those things. So it's important to just, again, be mindful and take an inventory. Think about, especially the low-hanging fruit. What are the things that you're using every single day? Personal care products is one of them. So we can be having these phthalates and these other parabens and fragrance and all of these things in our our deodorant, our toothpaste, all our lotions, things that we're putting in our hair, things that we're putting on our face, and that's easily absorbed. And the worst part about it is that we're doing it daily. So that would be the first low-hanging fruit that I would change when it comes to these environmental stressors. Get rid of the plastics. Use, especially, Tupperware, because even at room temperature, these plastics can leach into our food. But especially when they're heated, it becomes even more unstable and more problematic. So we want to remove plastics. We want to look at our personal care products, even colognes and perfumes. All of those things can be toxic to us, if depending on your genetics and depending on how many other things are piled up on top of that. So plastic, xenoestrogens, all of those things, we want to get rid of them, as well as our cleaning products. So if we're cleaning, there are many cleaning products now that have come out in the last several years that are just better for us. They're environmentally sustainable. They're also just not these crazy science experiments that have been linked to all of these other issues. This is one that I'm not going to speak on because I just don't feel just educated enough on it, but I do have to mention it because it seems like more and more it's becoming more of an issue. What I do understand about EMF exposure is that, let's say, at least in the United States, we're probably, I think our EMF is 60 to 80 hertz coming out of, our outlets as well as our telephones. And if we look at something like 5G would be about 30 to 60 gigahertz, which is 30 billion to 60 billion hertz. And there are actually, at this point, I believe thousands, if not at the very least hundreds of studies looking at EMF and its effects on the environment, its effects on health, and there's some very troubling things coming out. So we want to be conscious of EMF exposure. I have an EMF blocker on my phone. It's funny because if I've walked into a building with my EMF blocker on my phone, and this, if you're in a building that's one of these more modern buildings, that it's quote unquote smarter, so you have lots of these appliances, the TVs, all of these things that are putting out massive amounts of EMF on top of the halogen lights and these bright lights. I've had an EMF detector and I've put it right on top of my phone, and I know that the EMF blocker works because in an open space in nature, it would not detect EMF, it blocks it. But putting this EMF detector on top of my phone in one of these buildings, it was lighting up. So it didn't even matter that my EMF blocker was blocking the phone. And I get it. I put it in my pocket, so I don't want to be exposing my underparts to all of this this EMF. But when you're in a building that's just full of it, it becomes irrelevant. Air quality is really important. So, I know a lot of us live in cities, but just the ability to find open spaces and just find better air quality, spend time in parks and beaches now that they're opening up, hopefully for you. I know they're opening up for me. And focusing on that would be very important. I also read a book a few years ago that it was called the 3-Day Effect, I think it was called, and just basically looked at people who spent 3 days in nature and the effects on their health they were profound. So all of these things, it's funny because we intuitively know that they're good for us. We just know it. And now, of course, when we study it seems that it's being proven out, it's being bore out. So putting it all together, I would just say that there's a few things that we want to think about. So do's, things that we do want to do, hormetic stressors, we don't want to be piling them all on top of each other. So for example, if you feel like you're weak right now, if you feel like your energy levels are low, that would probably not be the day to train fasted, do your sauna, caloric restrict, all of those things. You want to basically have a healthy dose of hormetic stressors, but you got to be conscious of that allostatic load. You want to make sure that allostatic load doesn't become too much where it's harmful to you. So we remember the hormetic stressors that I mentioned is, the sauna, the UV exposure. UV exposure is just good in general, for vitamin D production and just a bunch of other stuff. Aerobic exercise and resistance training. One of the things that I had to also put, because we can be doing aerobic exercise and training every single day of the week, every single day. But if we're only doing that for 30 minutes or even an hour and a half, it's not going to be nearly as good as movement throughout the day. Keep in mind that our ancestors, interestingly, burned about the same calories as us. And the reason why there's not a big difference in the amount of calories they burned is because we are consuming so much energy because the vast amount of processing that our brain has to do now with all the information and just the world that we live in. They burn those calories because they were moving throughout the day. They would be walking, they would be foraging, there would be periods of hunting and sprinting, but overall they would be just moving throughout the day. So one of the things that I made very important to, when I started this lockdown was I had to create a different schedule. I had a whole different schedule from before the lockdown. And now my schedule starts with my sauna in the morning meditation in the sauna. This morning I did 30 minutes, an extra 10 minutes, made a huge difference. It was amazing. And then I follow that up with a 45 to 60-minute walk in the morning, right when the sun is out. I make sure that I put it from 6:30 to 7:30, so the sun is rising and I'm getting that early UV exposure. Also very important for just setting our circadian rhythms is getting out in the sun the first part of the day, right when the sun rises. And then I come home, I work, I do one workout at 9:30, and then I'll do another workout like at 12:31. So instead of what I used to do, which I may continue this because I really have been liking it, and it does that, it accomplishes that goal of movement throughout the day, is several workouts. Instead of having one big block of time where you train for an hour and a half, how cool would it be to just break it up into 2 or 3 30 to 45-minute sessions throughout the day? And I just feel really, really good doing that. I feel better. And I know that because mental health is definitely something I've been focusing on lately because of this lockdown. And I've just felt just much better having that movement throughout the day. Then maybe after dinner, we usually do a walk, and the family just walks together. This is also really good for lowering your blood sugar after dinner. There's good research on that, which is important because, again, if we have these big swings in blood sugar, again, it shows that we have this metabolic dysregulation. And of course, over time, our insulin increases and that whole cascade inflammatory processes increases disease. And all of these chronic diseases are risk for those increases. So movement throughout the day, and just incorporating caloric restriction and time restricted feeding, just being mindful when we eat. If we want to incorporate caloric restriction, is very simple. If you want to do it without tracking, is basically you want to start paying attention to the way you feel after you eat. And if you were to rate your satiety on a level of 1 to 10, you would want to be at a 5, because a 10 would be, by far, you are just extremely full, and that's way too much. And it seems like 5 is that perfect number where you're satisfied. Maybe you can eat more, but again, our bodies, it takes us a while to really know how full we are. So maybe over time, after 30, 40 minutes, you realize that amount was perfect. You're not hungry. So that's just really good, a good way to incorporate caloric restriction. Of course, time restricted feeding would help us restrict calories better. And there's also research on this, is basically the amount of time that you spend eating. If you have a smaller window, your risk of overeating decreases. And I know this as well from this lockdown, because, I've been the last 2 weeks basically eating dinner. Most of the time I just eat dinner. If I do a really hard workout during the day, I might eat after that, but I've just been eating dinner and I've been feeling a lot better. Again, my metabolic rate is probably less right now because I'm not burning as many calories. I'm not, just the activity levels are not what they used to be. So, and of course, low carbohydrate diets. If we are just working with our physiology, and we're taking advantage of ketones, you'll see that that your metabolic health increases. And we've talked about this for years now. But just low carbohydrate diets, I think, would be very helpful in just making us resilient, and not only because of what they do for our metabolic health, but also because of the metabolic flexibility that we have when we have these low carbohydrate diets. We're just able to use different fuel sources better. And again, that makes us more resilient. Okay, don'ts. This is very important. Prolonged use of screens. I know that a lot of us are working from home, and we have to be on our screens all day. But for me, it's very simple. I put my phone down at night at 7 p.m. I usually, if I do watch TV with the boys, it's probably for an hour at the most. And I wear my blue light blocking glasses because that helps. Just that it helps. Blunt the effects of these screens on melatonin. It just helps you keep those melatonin levels a little bit higher. Of course, processed vegetable oils. It's troubling that 60% of the food that we eat today has processed vegetable oils. We assume that the food doesn't have it, but if you're buying meat that is pre-seasoned, it's likely going to have processed vegetable oils. If you're buying packaged foods, it's likely to have processed vegetable oils. If even some shakes will put these processed vegetable oils in it. So it's not just food. Popcorn, potato chips, all of them are cooked in these processed vegetable oils. So definitely something to be mindful of. If you're gonna have a vegetable oil, I would opt for olive oil or avocado oil. But for the most part, at least for us, we just stick to our saturated fats. They're nice and healthy. So we have everything from tallow to bacon fat to lard, leaf lard, duck fat, butter, and ghee. All of those, coconut oil even, we incorporate all of those regularly. Of course, excess sugar consumption. Anything that adds sugar to your food is probably going to be a packaged food. So if you stay away from packaged foods, that would be a great way to just make sure that you're not eating too much sugar. And of course, making good dietary choices, understanding what are the vegetables that are low sugar, what are the fruits that are low sugar. A lot of these starches are going to be high sugar. A lot of these fruits may be high sugar. And I'm not against carbs, if they have a purpose for performance. In healthy people who are at ideal body weight or trying to add muscle, it could definitely be helpful. But it definitely is more problematic with people who already have just metabolic dysregulation. So of course we want to minimize or remove altogether, if you can, as much as you can, environmental toxins, plastics, xenoestrogens, improve your air quality. One of the things I didn't mention about the sauna is that the sauna is also very helpful. There's actually a few studies looking at like metabolites, for example, patients who are trying to detox from, substance abuse. We see that there's a high increase of these metabolites coming out in the sweat if we're doing sauna. So that would be helpful, because if you are in a place like in a very crowded city, then using the sauna regularly could help your body detoxify all of the things that your skin is absorbing, all of the things that you're breathing. It's very, very important. And I think over time, that's going to be something that becomes even more important. So that's basically it, guys. I wanted to just thank you. Questions, I guess you can ask me later on at some point. But I want to thank you guys for this. And I want to thank all of my friends at KetoCon and Keto Evangelists for just putting on this online thing. You have my support. I love you guys. I think you guys are amazing, and I'll always support you guys. So thank you, KetoCon, and thank you for always giving me an opportunity to talk about what I love.